Complicated man first on BBC Two, Lenin's Secret Files.
His mood is bad.
His condition has worsened.
He becomes agitated.
Blood vessels are calcified.
Whole sections of the brain are deprived of fresh blood.
This brain is severely damaged.
Vladimir Ilyich is dangerously ill.
Once they held mass rallies in Red Square. Today, Russia's Communist Party can muster only a few hundred old diehards. The polished granite mausoleum behind them holds the mortal remains of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. In the Soviet era, his image was preserved and embalmed with the same reverence as his body.
Leading the people together with the people. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union is called the Leninist Party because Lenin was its founder, ideological inspirer, and leader.
The full weight of Soviet propaganda was deployed to promote a personality cult around Lenin.
Lenin. The people knew and loved him.
The man who founded the perfect socialist society had to be depicted as perfect himself.
That man represented a whole epoch. Everything that has been created and is being created in our Soviet land is connected with his name, with his plans.
Decades of communist propaganda have muffled Lenin's real voice.
Советская власть, каковы бы ни были преследования сторонников коммунизма в разных странах, советская власть неминуема.
Communism is inevitable and unavoidable. In the near future, it will take over the whole world.
Много недостатков в организации советской власти.
И сидит, вот мы, говорит, праздник сделаем.
But now the government of Russia wants to remove Lenin's body from the mausoleum and give it a proper burial. Hardline communists swear there will be blood on the streets before they let that happen. A party activist since 1918, Yevgenia Shister still remembers Lenin's death.
I was in Red Square that day. It was a very cold day. It was minus 31 degrees. They were playing Chopin's funeral march. It was freezing, but we stayed there for 6 or 7 hours until Lenin's body arrived and was placed on a pedestal. Millions of people came. There were no police, The people kept order themselves. The principal mourner was Lenin's fellow revolutionary, comrade and wife, Nadia Krupskaya. There was universal, heartfelt grief among the masses. They had lost the most precious of people. I had never seen anything like it. Lenin's niece is still fierce in his defense.
You see, some people want to wipe the memory of Lenin off the slate. From the very start, these people have been against the October Revolution, against change, and against everything Lenin did or wrote.
When she was a little girl, Olga Ulyanova was brought to see her uncle Vladimir. Crippled by a series of strokes, Lenin was living on a country estate at Gorky. His wife, Nadia Krupskaya, was in constant attendance. The house, which had been requisitioned after the revolution, hasn't changed since Lenin lived there. A man of simple taste, he insisted that dust covers be left on the furniture. They're still there. Local people remember seeing him in the grounds.
We knew that father was looking after Lenin, who was ill, and that he took him for walks. One day we came running to the window and saw Lenin. He kept waving to us in a friendly way, and we started jumping up and down by the window. My father and Lenin were both smiling.
I remember how all the people showed their grief and pitied him. He was so simple. He was one of us. He didn't even have fences round his house. Nothing like that.
In today's Russia, Lenin is becoming an unperson. His statue, which once had pride of place in the Kremlin, has been banished to a remote corner of the Gorky estate. Communists no longer have the power to shape history to suit the party line. In recent years, facts about Lenin, long forgotten, long suppressed, have been coming to light. Until the collapse of communism, they lay buried here in the Central Party archives. Only a handful of trusted party historians were allowed access to Lenin's secret files.
I used to work in the archive, where the files on Lenin were stored. We were not allowed to do anything with the unpublished documents, because we all had to swear to keep these state secrets secret.
The secret files were stored behind blast-proof steel doors in a labyrinth of underground vaults, specially strengthened to withstand the full force of a nuclear bomb.
Since the fall of the Soviet Empire, material written by Lenin has become available for the first time.
There is a good deal more material that is now emerging that shows Lenin in an uncomfortable light.
So there has been a sharpening of the picture. We also know something about the more intimate sides of Lenin also.
Modern historians can now assess Lenin's personal life and its impact on the course of history. Professor Robert Service examined the files on behalf of TimeWatch.
From the archives now, we're beginning to understand properly the whole psychological support system that was available to Lenin. The way that Lenin turned particularly to two people. He turned to his wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, and he turned to his sister, Maria Ulyanova. These two people just kept him going. He needed people who would give him emotional support, tell him he was the great revolutionary leader that he thought he was anyway.
An activist before she met him, Nadia Krupskaya was with Lenin throughout his revolutionary career.
She had been exiled to Siberia too. Krupskaya and Lenin were married and settled down.
When Lenin left Russia, she followed him through the revolutionary undergrounds of London, Paris, Munich, and Geneva.
These two were together all their lives. She was his friend and helpmate.
But the archives show that their marriage was more complicated than it seemed.
There were always fairly well-founded rumors that in 1911, whilst he was in Paris, Lenin had become involved with Inessa Armand, a member of the Bolshevik Party, born in France but brought up mainly in Russia. But there'd never been any firm evidence of this.
Inessa Armand was the rival in love of Nadezhda Krupskaya herself for the affections of Lenin. You only have to look at these letters, the one written in 1913, to see that in 1913 she was passionately in love with him.
I longed to see you, but I would have died on the spot if I really had. Whenever you came into Nadia's room, I lost control of myself and behaved like a fool.
You've got to remember, this was a strikingly beautiful woman who was used to men being impressed by her and not the other way around.
I went up to one of our ideological bosses at some meeting or the other and said, how about publishing the letters between Lenin and Inessa Armand? I tried to convince him that there was nothing wrong about this because it was beautiful and romantic, a true love story. He stared at me and said, what? Do you really want the people to find out that Lenin was carrying on with a mistress?
Inessa Armand was an extremely attractive woman. She was charming, she was beautiful, she was clever. She was not only a revolutionary and a Bolshevik, she was also sexually attractive.
As a matter of fact, they became intimate in 1913. Inessa Armand made a very strong impression on Lenin. She was a brilliant piano player, and they had the same taste in music.
Lenin loved Beethoven's Appassionata.
Charles Rappaport said he popped into a small cafe in Paris and saw a couple sitting at a small table. It was Lenin and Inessa. He looked like a hot-blooded Asian who was eating her with his eyes. Well, she was all exquisite, just like a French aristocrat. So somehow this eternal triangle had to be resolved.
Inessa Armand was a very independent woman, but Lenin did not feel entirely comfortable about the affair. That's why, as some people remember it, there are indications that Lenin had to explain himself to his wife Nadia, and she said that she would go along with it if his heart was set on it. So Lenin told her, in the spirit of the party, you and I will remain comrades.
For a while, Lenin broke off the affair with Inessa.
So, we've split up, my darling. You ask if I'm angry with you. No, I don't think you did it for your own sake.
Lenin had an extraordinary attitude to leaving pleasures behind if they got in the way of revolution. He became too obsessive about chess. So playing chess was dropped shortly before the revolution. He started to like to go skating too often, so he gave that up too. He said once to the writer Maxim Gorky that he had stopped listening to Beethoven because Beethoven's music was so beautiful that it made him forget that in politics it's always necessary to bang people on the head. It stopped him thinking, in other words, about the terrible nature of the world and the terrible things you had to do in order to turn it into a beautiful world.
First World War was a turning point. He was almost unique in proclaiming the slogan, turn the imperialist war into a civil war. Turn your guns not against your fellow workers, but against your bourgeois enemies.
On the Eastern Front, Russian soldiers died in millions. To foment the growing unrest in Russia, the German High Command arranged for a sealed train to take a party of Russian revolutionaries from Zurich to Petrograd. On that train were Lenin, his wife Nadia, and his mistress Inessa Armand. When they arrived in Petrograd, the Tsar had already been overthrown. To subvert the provisional government, Lenin's fellow Bolsheviks were busy stirring up trouble in the streets. The terrorist Joseph Stalin and his ultra-radical rival Leon Trotsky were fanning the embers of revolution.
Trotsky would later say that if he and Lenin had not returned from exile to Petrograd, the October Revolution would never have happened. And he went on to say, if I had returned and Lenin had not, there would have been no revolution. In other words, Lenin was the main motor, the engine of the October Revolution.
In his masterpiece, October, the great Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein glorified the revolution.
The government is wobbling. We must smash it whatever the cost. It would be death to wait.
In at least one respect, myth and reality do coincide. It was the force of Lenin's ideas and personality that brought about the revolution. For it was he who insisted the Bolsheviks seize power by armed force.
Lenin found it very difficult to convince the other Bolsheviks he was right. All of them, including Stalin, opposed his doctrine. They thought that Lenin was in too much of a hurry and that the country was not yet ready for socialist revolution.
80 years later, new evidence from the party archives suggests why Lenin was so anxious to force the pace of history.
Lenin knew from the age of 30 that there was something wrong with his brain. The Swiss specialist had told him this.
Lenin always remembered that an old peasant in the village of Shushenskoye had foretold his death. He said he would die of a stroke.
And possibly from that time onwards, he knew that he had to cram into his revolutionary career as much as possible into as small a time frame as possible. He was running his politics against the clock of his biology. He knew that he might die one day, far too soon.
If Lenin hadn't taken the lead, if Lenin hadn't insisted on it and categorically demanded it, the Bolsheviks would never have seized power in October 1917. That's why the October Revolution is inextricably linked to Lenin's name.
Lenin moved into the Kremlin, where Inessa Armand was given a flat of her own. Lenin and his wife had separate bedrooms. Lenin's was typically austere. Here he wrote a series of public speeches. The full story of what happened to him when he delivered a speech at the Michelson factory on the 30th of August is contained in the secret archives.
As we now know from looking at some of these archives, his sister pleaded with him not to give this speech because there had been an assassination earlier in the day of a leading Bolshevik.
Lenin ignored the warning. He had just left the factory where his car was waiting for him when someone pushed through the crowd armed with a pistol. Lenin was hit twice, in the shoulder and the neck. After the attempt on his life, the communist government officially declared the Red Terror. Industrialists, landed gentry, priests, lawyers, even their relatives were rounded up. Years later, communist propaganda was still maintaining they were all agents of foreign powers.
Practically all of those who were rendered harmless had ties with foreign intelligence arms and had degenerated into small gangs of saboteurs and assassins and stopped being a political force.
Some were tried by revolutionary tribunals, but several hundred others were taken to the cells of the secret police and shot dead.
It's then that the regime of the one-party state becomes really decisively also a terror dictatorship. And Lenin himself approves of this while he's recuperating.
During this bloodbath, Lenin was recuperating at Gorky. He thought the Red Terror hadn't gone far enough.
Our regime is incredibly mild, more like milk pudding than iron.
Lenin believed that in circumstances such as war or revolution, which is a form of armed struggle, the use of terror was justified. That was why Lenin had studied the history of the French Revolution and defended the Jacobin terror.
In December 1917, Lenin wrote an article, How to Organize a Socialist Competition, in which he made the case for imprisoning and shooting the enemies of socialism.
He believed that as a political means, terror, executions, hostage-taking, etc., were justified, and without any limitations. This was part of the Bolshevik Party's doctrine.
Это было тогда доктрины большевистской партии. That autumn, Lenin returned to the Kremlin. Now in complete command of the mass media, the Communist Party spread the message that Lenin had fully recovered from his bullet wounds.
The people wanted to see with their own eyes that Lenin was alive, so Lenin posed especially for the newsreel. These sequences were filmed in October of 1918, 2 months after he was wounded.
Not for the last time, the Russian people were deceived about the true state of a leader's health. A bullet, still lodged in Lenin's neck, may have been aggravating his medical condition.
One has to consider the possibility that Lenin's medical condition produced moods of elation, very high, positive moods, followed by very, very low depression. And in moods of very low depression, he was capable of going into a rage about politics.
The secret archives have revealed a crueler and more violent side to Lenin's character.
We know of several documented examples of this. Some of these show that in the summer of 1918 in Nizhny Novgorod, Lenin gave orders to hang 100 kulaks in public in order to force others to hand over their grain to the state.
Hang no fewer than 100 well-known rich peasants. Make sure that the hangings take place in full view of the people.
The violent mood swings caused by Lenin's brain condition may have influenced the ruthlessness and cruelty with which the communist regime was established.
Some people in our country have revised their judgment of Lenin solely on the basis of new documents which illustrate his brutality. For example, his orders to hang and shoot people, and his statements that civilians should precede Red Army soldiers when they went on the attack.
As civil war engulfed the former empire of the Tsars, and the Red Army battled against White Russian counter-revolutionaries and their foreign allies, atrocity begat atrocity. But while millions perished, Lenin continued to justify the Red Terror.
We threaten mass terror. If we don't use terror, we'll get nowhere. White terrorists will think that we are wet rags. Russians are too kind. They don't have what it takes to apply revolutionary terror.
All this is terrible, of course, and it certainly does change the image, which in the past has been hammered into our heads.
Remote from all the suffering, safe inside the Kremlin walls, Lenin seemed strangely unaffected by such horrors.
Out there was Russia, with all the chaos and the confusion. He had to then have a core of predictability, and he made sure he had it. This is a man who had to have a firm working center to his life to control all of this revolutionary chaos.
He always sought the shortest way to the truth and was always able to find that way. Lenin as an organizer, Lenin as a rationalizer was just as great as Lenin the revolutionary. His office and desk bear witness to his orderliness.
One of the things that made him most angry was if one of his immediate entourage or one of the servants disarranged his pencils. If he came in the morning and the pencils were out of place, then that was a subject of a reprimand. And he himself couldn't bear to sit at a desk when the pencils were unsharpened. This was a man then who was quite, one would say, unnaturally obsessed with order, neatness, appearance, predictability.
He was a writer, and he always stated, even in party questionnaires, profession, writer. Now this writer, who had spent his whole life writing books and articles, suddenly found himself the head of state, a dictator. So when it came to thousands of people killed, they were just lines on a sheet of paper. He never saw anyone get killed. He was not interested in the fates of particular individuals. They didn't mean a thing to him. To him, the numbers of those who had been killed were mere statistics.
Lenin believed he could take the philosophy and theory of Karl Marx and apply them to the real world. In the midst of war and revolution, Lenin found time to unveil a memorial to the founding fathers of communism.
Here is a man who considers himself, in a way, to be the vehicle of an idea. And that idea is the idea of the socialist revolution, of a whole new future, a whole new epoch for mankind. The Russian Revolution was supposed to be the spark that would ignite this vast mass of tinder into a great explosion in Europe.
And eventually, the globe would be a red socialist globe. All the way through the Civil War, he was wondering, could he start it off in the Czech Republic? Could he start it off in southern Germany? Could he start the revolution off in northern Italy? And then, in 1920, Lenin saw his chance.
Border conflict with Poland had erupted into full-scale war. The Poles marched into Kiev. When Lenin ordered the Red Army into Poland, he believed revolution would spread like wildfire to Germany.
One of Lenin's ideologues called Poland the Red Bridge, namely the country over which the Red Army would have to march to link the revolution in Russia with Germany.
As the Red Army advanced on Warsaw, Lenin was addressing the Comintern, the body dedicated to the spread of world revolution.
Lenin was as excited as anybody by the progress of the Red Army. Every day as they met in their Congress halls, huge map on the wall, little red flags were moved forward every day.
Lenin believed the Polish workers would rise up and welcome the Red Army as comrades and liberators.
And Lenin was swiftly had to realize that the very invasion itself sparked off a wave of Polish patriotism, and that the Polish workers predictably rallied to the national cause against the invading Cossack hordes.
Lenin was sending telegrams to Dzierżyński, the head of the security police. Why are you not shooting more Poles? Why are you not killing more landlords? Put the fear of God into these people.
But the Poles were not cowed. Their leader, Marshal Joseph Pilsudski, spotted a weak point in the Red Army's line of advance, and against all the advice of his general staff, he ordered the counterattack.
The Battle of Warsaw is one of the classic examples of reversal of fortune. Pilsudski delivered the classic flank attack, cut off links with the rear, and in effect destroyed this army, which was several 100,000 strong.
The Battle of Warsaw and the rout of the Red Army has been called one of the decisive battles of the Western world.
The consequences were very far-reaching. It meant that the revolutionary strategy was finished. From then on, the Soviet state was cut off, was isolated, and in fear of being directly attacked by its ideological enemies.
Lenin's dream of world revolution was over. Bolshevism was not to be imposed at the end of a bayonet.
The year 1920 was full of tragic events for Lenin. There was the debacle of the Polish campaign, the failure of war communism, and then the death of Inessa Armand.
These pictures show Lenin at the funeral of his beloved sister's husband. Now he found himself standing by the open grave of his lover.
I never saw any human being so completely absorbed by sorrow, by the effort to keep it to himself, as if others could have diminished the intensity of his grief.
The secret archives contain the diary which Inessa Armand was hastily scribbling in the last days of her life.
I have always been a great believer in love. Now I have no feelings for anyone at all, except for my children and for Vladimir Ilyich.
The diary ends in mid-sentence.
All of these events were, so to speak, entwined. They dealt Lenin a devastating blow and helped accelerate his illness.
There's a letter in the archives that is still unpublished. In it, Lenin's wife wrote that if Inessa had lived longer, Lenin would not have died so soon. Lenin was not a well man, and a grueling schedule was further undermining his health.
He was still complaining about headaches, insomnia, and general bad health.
In 1921, a series of doctors came to him. They started to think that possibly some of the symptoms might be related to syphilis. But then they tested that, and they reassured themselves that that wasn't what was wrong with him.
It was then decided that it was the bullet, still lodged in his neck after the 1918 assassination attempt, that was causing the problem.
And so they insisted on taking one of these bullets out.
From that point on, his condition went from bad to worse.
But the real shock came in May 1922, when Lenin suffered a stroke.
For 6 months, Lenin was in Gorky, away from his office in the Kremlin. As soon as he felt well enough, he rushed back. But he was not the man he had been. After only 2 hours at his desk, he felt too tired to carry on.
He made a speech at the Third Congress of the Comintern. He spoke in German, but he stammered and sometimes he was lost for words. Bukharin said that he embraced Lenin as he was walking back to the Presidium, and when he did, he could feel that Lenin was soaking wet with sweat. When he chaired meetings, he would often read out the wrong papers. Everyone around him could see that Lenin was not the man he once was. So on December the 12th or 13th, only a couple of months after he'd come back to work, he had another stroke. Although he could still speak, his arm and leg were paralyzed.
Once again, Lenin returned to Gorky. He was, as always, accompanied by his devoted wife and his sister. They read to him and took him out into the grounds, where he loved to hunt for mushrooms.
We saw a man on a bench, and we didn't know who he was. As we got nearer, our teacher said, "It's Lenin," and we thought, who on earth is Lenin? We'd never heard of him before. But he said hello and asked what we were doing. There was a sand pit, and we began to make shapes. He played with us for quite a while, for about half an hour.
The doctors prescribed complete rest. Lenin found it unendurable.
Lenin was the worst patient in world history. He refused to stop working. He actually said in a remark to his sister, as these archives show, that apart from work, there is nothing to me.
Life with Lenin was not easy. Nothing could be allowed to disturb his concentration. When he was working, there had to be complete peace and quiet throughout the house. Even when alone in a room with the door closed, he would not permit himself to make a sound.
So when he was composing his thoughts on a particular speech, he used to walk round the room on tiptoe so that he didn't disturb himself.
Lenin turned his rest home into a second office. He put in extra telephone lines so that he could stay in daily touch with the Kremlin. He struggled to maintain his grip on events, but he was frustrated. He was not getting any better. His doctors seemed baffled by his condition.
The doctors tried to forbid political meetings. I was extremely annoyed and sent them packing.
The thing is that when Lenin fell ill, he couldn't walk. He wanted to be able to do things by himself and kept trying to help the people who looked after him. At first, he would manage to stand up, then to make a few steps. But he still had to use his wheelchair when he wanted to go out, and my father and the other medical staff had to accompany him.
Lenin's health was a matter of such national importance that the Kremlin appointed a top party official to keep an eye on him. Lenin was pleased to see Stalin. He had always admired his steely ruthlessness.
Stalin visited him about a dozen times during the summer, and Lenin was in regular telephone communication with him.
Lenin trusted Stalin and confided his fear that if he lost his power of speech, life would not be worth living.
In the summer after his first stroke, the summer of 1922, he did ask Stalin if he would provide him with a cyanide capsule.
Stalin never gave Lenin the capsule. Instead, he wrote a letter, which has only recently emerged from the archives. In it, Stalin reported Lenin's request for cyanide to the Kremlin. By now, Lenin's deterioration was forcing the Politburo to wonder about his successor, and one man was perfectly placed to take advantage of this situation.
Stalin, at this stage, seems quite deliberately to have decided to keep Lenin isolated. Some have said that Lenin was effectively reduced to a position of house arrest. All communications were effectively under Stalin's control.
The archives contain daily reports on Lenin that the chief of security at Gorky was sending to the head of the secret police, himself a close ally of Stalin.
He had reason enough, therefore, to fear Stalin as the superintendent of his medical regime, as the man that had appointed the guards, as the man to whom the doctors were responsible.
10 days after another stroke, Lenin began to dictate a letter. It was, in effect, his political testament. He stressed that his words were to remain absolutely secret.
Stalin is too rude. I suggest that the comrades think of a way to remove Stalin and replace him with someone who has greater tolerance, greater loyalty, greater courtesy and consideration to the comrades.
Needless to say, the course of Russian history would have been completely different if Lenin had succeeded in dismissing Stalin from the post of General Secretary.
All Lenin's activities were reported on to Stalin via the two secretaries, one of whom was Stalin's wife. When, late in December, it became clear that Lenin was working on his so-called testament, Stalin was furious and famously rang Krupskaya, his wife.
Stalin was rude to Lenin's own wife, Krupskaya, extremely rude on the telephone.
And insulted her in the coarsest terms.
Lenin broke off personal relations with Stalin.
And Lenin actually wrote to Stalin saying that he was prepared to cut off all personal relations unless Stalin apologized.
Lenin received a grudging apology, but he no longer saw his former subordinate as an ally, more a threat.
He therefore was immensely suspicious of all those around him, of his doctors, of the guards, the house servants, of everybody that was in the household in Gorky. Even to the extent that Krupskaya would taste his food before he ate it.
In October 1923, Lenin summoned his Rolls-Royce and was driven to the Kremlin. All he wanted were some books from his study. But the secret police filed a report. Lenin was becoming a victim of the system he had created. That winter, his worst nightmare came true when a massive stroke left him unable to walk or talk.
According to his doctors, Lenin was devastated by his physical illness, and several times they caught him with tears in his eyes. But his mind remained sharp till his death.
That January, they wheeled Lenin out into the snow so that he could watch hunters shooting game in the woods. It was the last time he left the house at Gorky.
It's at Gorky that Lenin has this major stroke that reduces him to the condition of a human vegetable and then eventually kills him in January 1924.
This photograph was locked up in the archives for 70 years. The Russian people were being told that Lenin was on holiday when it was taken. At 6:50 p.m. on Monday the 21st of January 1924, the leader of the workers' revolution lay dying in the bourgeois surroundings of a millionaire's mansion.
He moaned quietly. A tremor ran through his body. I held his hot, damp hand as the towel turned red with blood and the stamp of death settled on his face.
To the common people, he was still a hero. The villagers of Gorky carried his coffin to the railway station for the journey to Moscow.
I was only a kid, but I could see everyone was really sad and upset. It was like he was one of the family. My brother and I only had one pair of boots between us, and we had a fight. Of course, it was my brother who got to go. I tried to follow him, but it was too cold. My brother and the whole village went there. It was so sad. It was such a loss.
Поезд остановился.
Our train had stopped at a small station just past the Aral Sea. The radio announced the news of Lenin's death. We had all been told he was getting better. The news shocked us. We gathered in the restaurant car, held a collection and cabled for 2 wreaths. One was fixed to the front of the train. We took the other one with us to Moscow.
Старым венком мы приехали в Москву. И народ хотел видеть Ленина.
The people wanted to see Lenin with their own eyes and refused to believe that he was gone. The All-Union Congress received a great number of letters and cables asking that Lenin be preserved for future generations. So it decided to satisfy the workers' demands and preserve Lenin in a mausoleum.
When Stalin and Lenin put forward the idea of a mausoleum where Lenin's body could be put on permanent display, many revolutionaries said it was obscene. Like many others, Krupskaya was also against the whole idea.
One more secret was locked away in the Central Party archives. A letter written after Lenin's death by his wife to one of the daughters of Inessa Armand.
And what she says is really quite striking. She says that she herself, Krupskaya, the wife of Lenin, is still thinking about Inessa, the lover of Lenin, and that she, the wife of Lenin, would have preferred to have Lenin buried alongside Inessa under the Kremlin wall and not in the mausoleum.
If the present government of Russia has its way, her wish may soon be granted. Under the ground beneath the mausoleum, they will turn off the equipment that controls temperature and humidity and preserves Lenin's body. Then, 80 years after the revolution, 8 years after the collapse of communism, Lenin will be removed from his sarcophagus of bronze and glass and laid to rest at last.